Hey scholars, so we're going to dive into Unit 5, Lesson 19. We're still discussing the fall of classical era empires. So for your do now, it's a little bit tricky because the text does introduce some names of people and concepts that are going to be covered in today's lesson. So I've taken the liberty to annotate some of the key points to help you answer the 3 questions that are required for your do now. So let's go ahead and take a look at the text. Wang Can, 177 to 217, was a politician, scholar, and poet who lived in the late Han Dynasty. He contributed greatly to the establishment of laws and standards during the founding days of the Kingdom of Wei, the forerunner of the state of Cao Wei in the Three Kingdoms period under Cao Cao. Wang Can also was renowned for his eidetic memory. Chen Shu's records of the Three Kingdoms describes an incident where Wang Can was watching a game of Wei Qi, and someone accidentally knocked into the board and scattered the pieces. Wang Can then placed the pieces back to their original positions based on memory. So go ahead and pause the video at this point and answer the 3 questions that you see to the left of the screen. Once you've completed your do now, your answers should look something like this. For the first question, Wang Can might be writing about politics, laws, and policies of the late Han Dynasty. When was he writing? Toward the end or fall of the Han Dynasty. And why was his history well received or believable? Well, we heard about his really incredible memory, where he's able to see something and then once it gets destroyed, picture it well enough to put the pieces back together where they belong. So just to recap a little bit, we've been discussing the fall of the Han Dynasty a lot, and particularly we've been comparing it to the fall of the Roman Empire. But it's a very unique space, and we want to give it some extra time to dig into these concepts and really understand the impact of the fall of the Han Dynasty. So we know that around 450 years of successful rule happened before the Han Dynasty fell. We know that there are quite a few factors that led to the fall of the dynasty, including natural disasters such as floods, locusts, and drought, political corruption, unworthy officials, various rebellions, and Hunnic invasions that caused a lot of problems to the north of the dynasty. But we also have learned from this study that the end of an empire doesn't mean the end of the people that live there. It just means a new reality for them as they continue to struggle through these changes in government and geography. So let's dive in a little bit to more of the content and context of today's lesson. Emperor Qian ruled from 189 to 220 CE until he was overthrown by the warlord Cao Cao. So if you're not super sure what a warlord is, it's really just a very powerful, successful general or military leader who's autonomously taken control, meaning he's taken control of an area by his own power and strength, and he's maintaining it. This overthrow that Cao Cao causes begins a series of civil wars between Cao Cao and the other powerful warlords in the area. There's no emperor anymore. There's just all of these warlords competing and trying to gain as much power as possible. The Three Kingdoms period starts and lasts from around 220 to 280 CE. In this period, China is split into 3 independently operating kingdoms, but a few steps have to happen before we get to that point. So, what you have next on your worksheet is this really brief video that's discussing these 3 brothers of the Shu. This is a historical fiction account that helps set the stage for the Three Kingdoms period of Chinese history. I want you to watch the video really briefly and jot down your answer to the question that's provided on the worksheet. But really, just know that these hypothetical brothers are trying to end political corruption in the Yellow Turban Rebellion and restore China. All right, so moving on to our DBQ before we get too much further into our lesson today. The question we're trying to answer is, how did the fall of the Han Dynasty influence China? So go ahead and pause the video here and click the boxes on your worksheet to indicate which annotations you think are necessary, and then we'll see how you did on the next slide. So for this DBQ, there's quite a few annotations that we need to include to make sure that the question is clear. How, we always know we're looking for by ways and means. We know that fall means to end or collapse. The Han Dynasty, we know, is a Confucian dynasty that lasts more than 400 years. The influence means impact or effect. And of course, China is the physical location of the Han Dynasty. And at this point in the history, there are many different warring families and a lot of warlords that we're having to deal with. So looking at document A. This is a kind of tricky document, so bear with me, but this is a map of the territory owned by the different warlords at the end of the Han Dynasty in the 2nd century. I want you to pay special attention to Cao Cao because that should be a name that's familiar at this point. In this part of Chinese history, the Han Dynasty has been split between several warlords. Cao Cao is probably the most prominent general. He's led many of these battles, all the way until he ultimately loses the Red Cliffs campaign in 208 CE near the bottom of the screen. There's a lot that leads up to this point, so at this time what I want you to do is actually pause the video and go under your lesson resources in Google Classrooms and watch the brief 4-minute video that gives you a breakdown of this Three Kingdoms period. It's going to walk you through all of the drama and the assassinations and all of the political instability that leads up to this point. So once you've completed watching that and reviewing this document, go ahead and jot down your central idea, and then we'll move to document B. All right, document B is much more clear and a little bit easier for us to follow with, especially after seeing that brief history on the other video. This is a map of the Three Kingdoms period of China in 220 to 290 CE. I want you to, briefly look back at document A, see how these two compare, right? From the first document, we learned that there are a ton of different warlords that are influencing the fall of the dynasty and the separation of the land. We know that Cao Cao is one of the most prominent because of that other document, but with this one, we're seeing something a little bit different, right? Make sure you're comparing it to document A and try to figure out why you think this is split from all of those different ones, like all of those very many factions, and they've lost some of the splits. We have 3 bigger kingdoms rather than all of these really tiny ones with all of these different warlords. So review this document, jot down your central idea. You can pause the video at this time to complete that. All right, moving into document C. This is a poem written by Cao Cao in 200 CE. We know that he's a general or a warlord who took control of the northern region of China. He's writing about the civil wars that broke out after the collapse of the Han Dynasty. So pay special attention to what he's saying and use what you know about him to see how his perspective might be influencing his writing. All right, let's take a look. This land had many righteous people who rose in arms to fight gangs of criminals. Troops gathered, but their strength scattered. People are prone to struggle for power. Soon, they began to slaughter each other. Yan Shu claimed the throne at the south. Yan Shao carved the imperial seat at the north. Fleas grow inside the soldier's armor. Common folk die by the tens of thousands. White bones are exposed in the wilderness, and within 1,000 miles, no rooster crow is heard. Survivors number 1 out of 100. Thinking of this breaks one's heart. So I want you to think about the imagery that he's using here because he's painting a very vivid picture, right? He wants you as the reader to be able to picture what he's seeing, but also consider what Cao Cao does for his living. He's a warlord. He's a general. He's one of the people causing the death and destruction that he's describing. But it doesn't seem like he's taking responsibility for that too much. So look back over this text. Make sure that you feel confident before you move into your central idea. You can go ahead and pause the video at this time and make sure that you include all of the criteria for success in your central idea. Moving on to our last document. This is an excerpt from A Song of Seven Sorrows, which is a poem written by Wang Can in 200 CE. This guy should be familiar to you. We learned about him in our Do Now. If you need to pop back over there and take a look at that, feel free. But he's writing about the experiences of just common people while the warlords are like fighting for control during this Three Kingdoms period, right? Try to make sure before you jump into this text that you know about the author, like remember what we already learned about him and how his position as a politician and a poet, how is that going to impact his writing, right? So let's take a look at the text. The western city thrown into lawless disorder. Jackals and tigers come to plot its ruin. Again, I abandon the capital and depart. I give myself to the barbarians of the south. As I leave the city gates, I see nothing before me, only white bones covering the level fields. On the road, a starving woman who hugs her child, then abandons him in the weeds. She turns to hear his screams and howls, then wipes her tears and goes on alone, saying, I hardly know where I shall die. How can I look after both of us? I drive on my horse, abandon her and depart, for I cannot bear to hear her words. Then at dawn, I cross the borders to Wu, where cares melted. I felt easy and free. Crops filled the level fields. Inns and homes filled the villages. Men and women walked the roads. In a land ruled by a sage, we enjoy such blessings. Though a stranger here, I still wish to stay. In this text, we clearly see the motivation for Wang Can's leaving the capital. Everything is being invaded, there's political corruption, things are just not going well. He sees some really heart-wrenching things on his way to the south where he thinks he's going to encounter barbarians, right? He thinks he's going to encounter these uncivilized people, and he doesn't think it's going to be better. But then when he gets to this new kingdom, he's totally surprised because they're prospering and they're doing really well and it's peaceful. And peace isn't something that he's seen for a very, very long time. So I want you to keep those elements in mind, right? And when he gets to the kingdom of Wu, what does he find, right? Make sure that you consider what this poem shows us about the changes in China and that you're keeping your DBQ in mind as you complete your central idea. So go ahead and pause the video at this time and complete that. So as we start to wrap up our lesson, you have an assertion that you'll need to write at the bottom of your worksheet. There's also some extra credit down there if you want to try to take advantage of that. But I want you to pay special attention to your DBQ when you're writing your assertion. It says, how did the fall of the Han Dynasty influence China? So before you complete that assertion, make sure you review documents A through D, review that video of the history of the Three Kingdoms period if you need to, and try to make sure that you're paying attention to the impact on the land, the actual political borders, how the people are being treated and how they're responding, how the government is working now that we don't have one set empire and one set emperor. Consider the perspectives of the authors of our last two documents and how their perspectives may impact their message to the reader, and also their perspective might be altered a little bit because one's a warlord and one's a politician and a poet. One has a lot of power, one not so much. So take this time, complete the rest of your worksheet, and once you're finished and you feel confident, hop over to your exit ticket. That is due by the end of today, as is this worksheet. If you have any questions, just let me know. I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and we will see you soon.